Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, here for a bonus episode. I've just copied Games from Folktales, so although it will still be available on your traditional podcatchers, it now is also available on YouTube. I set up the YouTube page 4 years ago and tried doing video, but it's so much easier to do podcasts that I never really used it for anything. There were 4 episodes up there. Some of them are strongly visual, so they're not transferable into the podcast medium. But I've scraped the audio out of the other 2 or 3, and now I'll be presenting them here as a bonus episode. If you are going to start following on YouTube, please be aware that some of the podcasts haven't transferred across. I'm not entirely sure why that is. The podcast transference is an automatic process done by Libsyn, who are my podcast hosts. It seems to disproportionately affect the longer episodes, so episode 75, for example, I've had several goes at trying to transfer across. It's the longest episode, and so it's just not making it, but it seems to be well within YouTube's specifications. Anyhow, so a bonus episode, time to hand over to Timothy from 4 years ago. Apologies for the poor sound quality. Hello, Mythic Europeans, and welcome to the second edition of the Ars Magica vlog. Next week, I'd like to cover some of the elements from Covenants, particularly castles, and if I have time, enemies. Did I say next week? Hey, I have a weekly vlog. I need to get a better name for the vlog. Games from Folktales, the vlog. It's all turning out rather well so far. Rather than discussing Covenants this week, I wanted to discuss the writing process and a couple of the books which were really influential in that writing process. The first one is The Cook's Companion by Stephanie Alexander. The Cook's Companion is the structure that became the Boon and Hook structure in Ars Magica. I bought this book when I was living in a tiny country town, librarianing, with my first ongoing librarian-y job. I was really bored. It's a huge cookbook. It kept me busy. I bought it from a bookstore which also acted as a gift store, and they had a huge cabinet full of different colours of sugared almonds. And on my way home with this book, I dropped it on the road, and the only reason it's not ripped to pieces is because it crushed a huge bag of sugared almonds. And so now, whenever I open it, I can smell sugared almonds. Strangely, the same thing happens to me sometimes when I open the Covenant book. Yeah, there's probably some sort of psychological problem there. Anyway, moving on. This book is in ingredient by ingredient rather than recipe by recipe or course by course. So if you want to look up, if you have carrots, you look up carrots. If you want to look up onions, you look up onions. At the time, this was the only cookbook I'd seen that worked this way. I have others now. Elton Brown's Good Eats cookbooks, for example, which are very similar in terms of their structure, but that gave me the idea for how the Boon and Hook structure would work, that we would present a boon or hook and then we would give examples of how you could use that particular element. Now, in terms of using the elements, we wanted to do demonstrations, but we didn't want them to be binding in canon. That is, we didn't want you to then have to include that if you were writing a later book. Say, I said, Covenant and Thebes that does whatever. We didn't want the people who then wrote Thebes to have to include that, and so we used an unreliable narrator, who is called Marco the Liar. He is often drunk, is often spaced out, fairy affected, and I've revisited him in some fiction, which I did for Naga Demon. Naga Demon's an annual competition to write role-playing material, and mine tends to become fiction for some reason, and in that I suggest that Marco's stories to him are real, that his experience of Mythic Europe, because he's so closely tied to 2 of the realms of power, are that these things actually happened to him. This is because I believe that Ars Magica should be played so that you don't use all of the Tribunal books at once. You just use the Tribunal you're in, or maybe less than that. And if you're in London, the Constantinople that's in your world should be absolutely different than if you're playing in Thebes. And then the London should be... That's just a personal opinion. I know a lot of people don't agree. Marco was inspired by this book. It's Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. It's brilliant, and I suggest you read it, because it's tiny. In it, Marco Polo is telling stories to Kublai Khan about the cities in Kublai Khan's empire, and Kublai eventually says to him, you never leave the capital, how do you see all these cities? And Marco says, now that the empire is infinite, I don't need to, because every city that I can think of must be represented somewhere. Kublai has a go, and Marco says, no, you're getting it wrong. The elements in your city have to be tied together by a single motif or narrative, which is the kits at the end of the Covenant design section. So those are the 2 books which, for me, were the key in coming up with the structure for that section of Covenant. Next week, we'll be discussing castles, and if we have time, enemies. So I'll see you then. Hello Mythic Europeans, welcome to the Ars Magica vlog. Today we'll be discussing castles. Let's start by looking at how groups are structured in the stories for most role-playing games. Most role-playing games have an ethos for the characters in their stories. In Pendragon, for example, you all play knights who serve the same lord, and because you intermarry each other's sisters as the campaign goes along, eventually your family trees intertwine, and you're playing the aristocracy of a large chunk of Arthurian Britain. In Dungeons & Dragons, I know that this is a very general statement, please don't flame me in the comments, your characters tend to have skills that fit together, so that you form a single team, and your team tend to be travelling adventurers. I know those are generalisations, but when I'm describing Ars Magica, similarly I'm going to have to make generalisations. In the vanilla setting, your characters are the leaders of a community. Now, when I say that your characters are the leaders of a community, each player has more than one character. Most players have at least two. Their mage, who is a member of the group who are the political leaders of the community, and a companion who is anyone else that it's interesting to tell stories about and whose actions can have a decisive effect on their community's life. It doesn't matter so much what the character's powers are as what the character's ability to affect the narrative is. For example, a character who's a beggar may not have a great deal of wealth or power or influence or combat skill, but in, say, a story like Oliver Twist, Dodger, who is a beggar, has a vast ability to manipulate the way that the story progresses, and so he'd be suitable as a companion. In addition to the mages and companions, there are a group of characters called the Grogs, and Grogs are played communally. That is, you pick up and use a Grog whenever it's suitable for that Grog to be used. No one gets particularly attached to the Grogs because they are mostly military characters, and they do die quite a lot. Grogs originally, if we can believe earlier versions of the game, were based on Shakespearean characters like the military characters in Henry V. Henry V is the young prince, and he's off invading France and marrying princesses and making stirring speeches and reworking the shape of the world. Undercutting that are 3 or 4 humorous characters who rollick around and get put to death for thievery and are racially intolerant to each other and then get humiliated by the people who they've been bullying on racial grounds. These characters would be Grogs. In Ars Magica, the Grogs mean that whenever there's a scene, even if your main characters, the mage and the companion, aren't present, you have an effect on the scene. You have someone who you can play for that scene. If a Grog becomes well loved enough and experienced enough and able to modify the story enough, you'll redesign him as a companion. In Ars Magica, to make sure that the mages, who are the most powerful characters, don't dominate each story, the experience point system has been made somewhat different to most role-playing games. In Pendragon, you get experience checks for using an ability in a dangerous situation during that year. In Dungeons & Dragons, you gain experience basically by killing stuff and stealing its loot. In Ars Magica, you get experience for not being on the adventure. That is, a mage who takes a lot of time out of his laboratory to adventure, to do other things, is not developing his powers at the same rate as his age mates. Now, there are a lot of mages who just do this. They learn the spells they want to learn, they develop the powers they want to develop, and then they have some other great goal that they would like to progress. They'd like to hand Constantinople back to the Emperor of the Greeks. They'd like to build a new island for themselves in the North Sea. They'd like to discover the innermost secrets of Cainite language. They want to be able to restore life to the dead, to heal people easily, because that's one of the flaws in Hermetic magic compared to other magic systems. Healing's a bit tricky and expensive. So those characters are free to adventure and do whatever they wish, but if they're wanting to gain a great deal of more experience, they have to not adventure, which leaves most of the adventuring in the hands of their companions. Companions are non-magical characters or slightly magical characters who act as the ambassadors for mages to the rest of the world. In part, this is important because in Ars Magica, mages are slightly creepy. Dogs bark at them, horses won't carry them and shy when they come near, and people who are around most mages, and you can exclude your character from this if you wish, most mages feel distrust, unease. In addition to these three sorts of characters, there is another sort of character, and that's your home. Where your characters live is a central character in an Ars Magica game, and its environment changes due to the success and failure that your other characters experience during earlier stories. Some of the changes are just purely physical and act as reminders of good stories at a later time. So your characters are defending their castle against a horde of goblins or something, and you're standing behind the stone walls and you think, when we started this game, our characters had wooden walls, because most castles in England are made out of wood, but we defeated that very knight, and we took his treasure, and we did the ritual so that his gold didn't turn back into autumn leaves at sunrise, and after that, we spent the money to get these stone walls, and so the physical structure of the Covenant reminds you of excellent stories that you've told in the past. Some players deliberately play this up. Their mages keep trophy rooms, and they have descriptions of the trophy rooms, or the laboratories, which are the personal suites of their mages, contain mementos, and so whenever the characters are engaged in scenes in those places, you have callbacks to excellent stories that you've previously told. So an Ars Magica game, because mages are deliberately moved off centre stage by the experience system, tends to involve a single mage and a group of companions and some grogs dealing with situational story. I tend to think of Ars Magica games as a little bit like television shows that are based around a single location, like Stars Hollow, or The Name of the Village in Hamish Macbeth, which has escaped my memory for the moment, or Deep Space Nine. The characters who are there deal with the problems that either come to their home, or which allow them to extend the influence of their home, or allow them to reach their own personal, non-communal goals. And you don't have all of the ensemble on stage at the same time. In Stars Hollow, you have Lorelei or Rory, or sometimes a supporting character as the main character for that story, and you have a flock of supporting characters. In Deep Space Nine, sometimes you'll have the whole bridge crew, but most of the time you won't have the whole bridge crew. You'll be dealing with one individual who's dealing with a particular problem assorted by various red shirts. Some people take a little while to adjust to this idea of ensemble-style play. They're used to the idea that their way of judging whether they're being successful in the role-playing game is whether their character is racking up experience points, and that's not how Ars Magica works. Many people do like their mages to become more and more powerful as their characters age. Other people like to play their mages with a greater or lesser level of involvement, using them perhaps in one story in 4, and once they reach a certain point where they're no longer struggling against the challenges that the group are facing, they like to put their mage into a sort of semi-retirement, or even a complete retirement, and use their apprentice or some other younger magician for whom the risks that the Covenant are facing, which as a group they've agreed to when they're structuring their saga, are more challenging and more interesting. Another point that I'd like to bring up about where your characters live, and I'll call them castles because most of them are. There are exceptions. There are some groups of mages who travel about on ships or in merchant caravans, or who live in caves or what have you. But thinking about castles, in other games a castle is something that you aspire to. In Ars Magica it's something that's part of the standard kit. Indeed, by choosing to have a castle, you've taken a flaw and you will be rewarded with resources that you can use in other stories in exchange for choosing a castle, in the same way that you would be given additional resources in exchange for choosing an enemy or choosing to be cursed. Castles in Mythic Europe are a machine, and what the machine is for dominating the landscape within a 20-mile radius. A mundane nobleman who sees your castle thinks that the reason you have it is so that your cavalry units can raid up to 20 miles away and come home without resting their horses out in the open overnight. That's what castles are for. They're for marking dominance of the landscape, which is why if your mages are in England or in Sicily, and you have a castle, and the king hasn't given you permission, then you've volunteered for a whole world of trouble. And if you're in other places, like parts of France and parts of Switzerland, and you have a castle and the king hasn't given you permission, he wonders why you're richer than he is, because the kings in those places simply can't afford Newcastle. So, in Ars Magica, the way you define your home is one of the ways you define the arc of the saga. You define the historical events that you wish to incorporate into your story, and you can use its physical structure to reflect the successes and failures that you've had in previous stories. Next week, we're going to talk about enemies. Every group in every role-playing saga has some sort of enemies, but in Ars Magica, as part of the saga design process, you can gain resources to use in other stories by selecting interesting enemies. So, I'll see you next week.
Hi Mythic Europeans, we're out of the study, I have a decent shave and we're properly lit today because I'm at work, or in half an hour I will be at work. Today I'm in the Digital Media Lab at Helensvale Library. You can't see it, but it's pretty epic. We have like 3D printers and all these kinds of ridiculously advanced things. I'll be showing people how to record audiobooks, but to get back to the subject at hand, let's talk Ars Magica and enemies. If you're going through the Covenant design rules and you don't know which hooks to pick enemies. And the reason you should pick enemies is because you're going to have them anyway. In most styles of story, someone will be opposing what you do. And in the Covenant design process, these people are called enemies regardless of why they're opposing you or whether they're opposing you with force. Since you're going to have enemies anyway, you and your fellow players should sit down, decide who these people are, and in exchange, be given resources you can use in other stories. Enemies is deliberately the cheap, easy, useful choice because your story guide has to come up with these things week after week to make sure that your story keeps progressing. And so, if you tell them in advance, we are going to do the sort of things which will lead to a band of pirates hating us and wanting to kill some of our servants, that's great because it gives them prep time, and in exchange, the system rewards you. As your characters develop, you'll find that your enemies also develop. A simple pirate, driven to extremes by your player characters, may make deals with infernal powers, for example. Magicians who you drive to extremes may call in the law, or they may form political unions to oppose you. Because you have enemies which will develop over time as your characters also develop over time, you should put some care into the premise. Don't plot out what's going to happen in their lives, but make them interesting enough that they can last for multiple stories. Also, don't be afraid to kill them, because if you've watched Game of Thrones, you'll know that as soon as you kill some guy, his brother, neighbour, nephew, lover turns up to avenge him. So enemies can persist, even if yours is the kind of group who prefers to deal with their enemies with balls of fire. So, to recap, if you're looking through the boons and hooks, and you don't know which hooks to take enemies. I'll see you next week.
Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast